Okay, two things I need to note before I tell this story. One, the names have been changed to protect the innocent and the not-so-innocent. And two, I call it the worst day of my filmmaking career, quote-unquote, but it happened while I was still in film school, and while it wasn't done for a class, it definitely wasn't a fully professional shoot, which will become pretty clear pretty quickly. Anyway, during my 4 years in film school, when I wasn't directing, I was usually the cinematographer on other people's projects. In its simplest terms, that's just the person who does the camera stuff. I knew my way around the state-of-the-art and low-budget camera gear back then, much more than I do now, honestly, so that's generally where I ended up. So it was on the project this story is about, which was made relatively late in my sophomore year. The production was led by two people who I'll call Elsa and Syphilis. Elsa, who would later direct a few projects I worked on, including her thesis, was someone I considered and still consider a dear friend. Here she was essentially working as producer, or at least as close as you can get to that at the student level. By her own admission, she was more comfortable with the theoretical side of film than anything that happens on set, but she did well within her means. She was often intensely contrarian, which could rub people the wrong way, but she backed that up by being uniquely brilliant, and she always treated me exceptionally well. The film's director, Syphilis, on the other hand, well, you could probably guess based on the nickname I picked for him, which was actually something people at the school used to call him back in the day. When I knew him, he was pushing 40, and in that time had racked up a dishonorable discharge from the Navy and at least one divorce, which mandated child support payments that he refused to pay for what he claimed were ideological reasons, but which transparently were not. Everyone had a distinct horror story involving this guy, from intensely awkward drunk texts that could probably have been classed as prosecutable harassment to, in my case, literal threats of violence. If you're wondering how those two could ever work together, yeah, people back then were surprised too. They even had a production company, which they registered as an LLC for some reason. Personally, I think it mostly comes down to Elsa being way too nice to everyone and giving them way too much benefit of the doubt. To his credit, though, Syphilis wasn't the reason this specific day went to shit. That would be the film's writer, who was also the one who put up $1,500 to fund the project. I'll call him Burroughs. I didn't give him an outright negative name because, in spite of the story you're about to hear, Burroughs was a fundamentally decent guy. He was usually an actor, and he had worked on a few student projects by that point, always putting in good work and being a really cool guy to just hang out with. One small moment from one of those shoots sums up his character pretty well, I think. I'm a vegetarian, and had been for a few years at this point. But as sometimes happened, the director forgot that, so I didn't have much to eat apart from some snacks. Burroughs saw that I wasn't eating much, immediately clocked without my telling him that I was a vegetarian, and offered me a PB&J that he had brought just in case. So for everything that's about to transpire, let me be clear that fundamentally, Burroughs was a good man. Back to the story. This day wasn't actually a shooting day proper, but rather a prep day from a day or two before the shoot was to start. I was picked up by Elsa early in the afternoon with the goal that Syphilis and I would visit the locations to discuss how to light and shoot them. Then they'd pick up the check from Burroughs before dropping me off. The stuff I was there for went off without a hitch, since the script, while honestly pretty decent, was also very simple, and thus not the hardest thing in the world to shoot. But things went south when it came time to get a hold of Burroughs. Here are a few details to really set the scene. 1. This is taking place at Syphilis' house, which, if dictionaries had pictures, would have definitely been the photo used for the entry labeled Crack House. And 2, we had just stopped at a dollar store to get some snacks, and because it was the Halloween season, I decided to get an entire box of Boo Berry cereal. So picture the next scene happening from the point of view of a nerdy 19-year-old sitting on the couch in a crack den eating Boo Berry from a box by hand. I'll give you a second to put that image together in your head. I know that's a lot of details. Good? Let's continue. So, Elsa and Syphilis had set up a time with Burroughs for him to come over and drop off the check. When Burroughs didn't show for about an hour, Elsa called him to see what was up. I remember her putting the cell phone to her ear and in her usual chipper tone saying something like, "Hey Burroughs, was just wondering if you were still coming by." Then she got awfully quiet. Then, after a few seconds, she hung up. Then she spoke again. Fuck! Not the last time someone would shout fuck on this day, if you can believe it. I found out, in bits and pieces, because Elsa was angrier than I had ever seen her and probably would ever see her, that Burroughs had told her that she and Syphilis, and me, but he didn't know that, would have to come to his place to get the check, and that he couldn't leave his house because he was, and I quote, hiding. I can't remember how they got his address, which Burroughs didn't give them at first, but once they got it, they realized he lived close to an hour away. So, with Elsa apologizing to me for this day going on much longer than it was supposed to for me, we all got in the car, punched the address into the GPS, and headed that way. To be honest, I'm not sure how the GPS even managed to get us there. It really felt like the edge of civilization, with the road leading to Burroughs' house being a gravel path that felt like it ran for miles and looked like it hadn't been driven on in decades. But somehow we made it to his place, a trailer atop a steep hill with no other houses around for miles. Elsa rang the doorbell. No answer. After a minute, she rang again. Still no answer. After another minute, she lifted her hand toward the doorbell, but before she could press it a third time, a pained voice came out from inside. "God damn it, I'm coming." The door opened and Burroughs was standing there, shirtless and looking absolutely awful, like he had aged 20 years in the month or so it had been since I last saw him. He told us to come in, and, probably against our better judgment, we did, tiptoeing around the piles of dog shit on the floor of his living room. Burroughs crumpled into an old recliner, and Elsa and Syphilis made nervous attempts at small talk. Syphilis asked Burroughs what he had been up to, and Burroughs responded, self-abuse. A silence fell on the room, since neither Syphilis nor Elsa nor me knew how to respond to that. The silence was broken by Burroughs speaking up again. "You know I'm an addict." His inflection heavily implied that this was not new information to either Elsa or Syphilis. And I'll admit, at that point I started to get mad. These motherfuckers knew that Burroughs was an addict, and not only decided to keep working with him, but brought me along with them to his house? Of course, they couldn't see how mad I was because I was standing in the doorway and looking out the screen door to be as far as away from the situation as I could be while physically remaining in the house. Then I heard Burroughs say, "You're scaring me." It took me a second to realize he was talking to me. He told me to take a seat, and I reluctantly did, staring at the floor the whole time. Syphilis, to his credit, made sure to position himself the closest to Burroughs since he was bigger than me or Elsa and could probably handle Burroughs if the worst came to pass. Still, by this point, there was an irreducible part of me that was certain I was going to die that day. Finally, they managed to bring the conversation to the check that we came there for, and Burroughs walked over to his checkbook but was too fucked up to even hold a pen, so the entire trip was completely pointless. On the way out, Burroughs, in one last moment of impotence, asked Syphilis how much he weighed, which is code for "I bet I could kick your ass," but Syphilis shut that down and we left as quickly as we could. When we had made it into the car and shut the doors, each of us exclaimed, in a unison that must have sounded almost musical, "Fuck." Turns out neither Elsa nor Syphilis had any idea that Burroughs was an addict, so that was news to them too. They understandably considered canceling the project and just ghosting Burroughs, but he knew where the campus was and where Syphilis lived, so they decided, pragmatically, that if he reached out to them with the money, they'd take it and make the movie. And if he reached out for literally any other reason, they'd call the cops. The following day, he actually brought the check to them, so the movie went ahead as planned. Unfortunately, this story doesn't have a happy ending, if you can believe it. In addition to being the writer and backer of the movie, Burroughs also acted in it, and he was in awful shape during the whole shoot, barely able to get a half dozen words out without turning beet red and doubling over in pain. As you can expect, this irretrievably hurt the film as a whole, which frankly didn't turn out well at all. I ended up throwing out most of my plans on the cinematography side just so we could get the thing done several hours ahead of schedule and be rid of this damn project. Regrettably, that also had the knock-on effect of making the edit, done by Elsa under the direct supervision of Burroughs, an absolute nightmare, and I heard no end of stories about that whole mess from Elsa herself. In the end, the film took a weekend to shoot, but over a year to edit. When it was finally finished, it barely made it into any festivals. I think the only ones it got into were locals. Won absolutely no awards anywhere, and even almost a decade later has probably been seen by fewer people than my least viewed video on this channel. I didn't hear from Burroughs after that, as he stopped working on student projects, probably because nobody would cast him after the story got out. And less than a year after the movie was finished, I heard from a friend that he had died. I've told this story a few times. For better or worse, it's one of the most interesting things to ever happen to me, so it makes for good conversation at parties, especially if I leave out all the depressing stuff at the end. But that day is important to me for a big reason. Because even after going through all that crap for a movie I was pretty certain from the beginning wasn't going to turn out well, I still didn't doubt, for a moment, that filmmaking was what I wanted to dedicate the rest of my life to. I had known I wanted to make movies for years by that point, but that was the day I realized that nothing could stop me from wanting to make movies. If having my life threatened by a drug addict couldn't make me rethink this line of work as my life's ambition, then nothing could. Since that day, I've had terrible days as a filmmaker. I've shot for hours in below freezing temperatures. I've had a wardrobe assistant steal like 80% of our wardrobe after conflict with the department head. I've worked on a film where the effects had to be redone from scratch on the first day of shooting because the previous effects person left without telling anyone. And yet, none of those days have come close to making me reconsider filmmaking as the thing I've oriented my soul toward. And I think being met with such heavy adversity all those years ago is a big reason for that. So in spite of everything, I think I owe Burroughs my thanks for proving to me that when I was in middle school and said I wanted to make movies when I grew up, that wasn't just me being a dumb kid who wanted a glamorous-sounding job. It really was what I wanted, more than I've ever wanted or will ever want anything else in my life. Because without Burroughs scaring the shit out of me all those years ago, I don't know if I would have ever seen that as clearly as I do now. Rest in peace.